I mean, I can see some patterns, and I have some understanding of things that go on, and I don't want to sound like a fool saying, "Oh no, there is no paranormal in the world." Well, there is quite a lot. There is so much that we don't know about it. The problem is that when you have interest of different states and regimes getting into this research, then the trail breaks down. You don't, sometimes things are not what they seem to be, and I wish we had an independent scientific, research body that could truly research such objects. But right. I don't trust, our modern scientists as well, because many of them don't care about science as such. All they want to do is say, to remove the inconveniences. That's why they would say, there is no proof of UFOs. No matter how much proof you put on their table, no matter how many, highly trained military people come up with this.
Well, you see, I think there's a distinction to be made. I don't know how you feel about this, but I know since you really do approach this from a scientific standpoint and you're interested in finding out what's true as opposed to just what makes a great story, I would say that almost everybody would agree that factually there are unidentified flying objects. You can't deny that there are objects in the skies that can't be identified. Everybody would have to agree that there's a hard list of the number of sightings, radar blips, things that have happened that have never been identified. It's that next jump that's hard, I think, for some people, that belief that these are extraterrestrials. Being an unidentified flying object, okay, given. I mean, like you have that story, don't you report on that story about the UFO that kept being reported around Russia that turned out to be some new experimental unmanned aircraft?
Something like that, yes.
Wasn't it something like that, like a military?
I believe, yeah.
Is in Siberia. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, things are in the skies are unidentified. The question is, are they being driven by extraterrestrials? That's the big question.
What I like is that the answer, I believe the Soviet Academy of Science came up, that they can explain 95%. They just don't know what the five remaining percent are, what they can be. And they say it's maybe a new physical phenomena which we don't know about yet. We'll get to it. And this is good. 5% is good. I believe their military would say 20%. But even 5% will take. If only they would go ahead and really study that, 5%.
Well, that kind of, in a way, that brings us back to the story we started with in this segment about this remote deep water lake that's in Central Asia. Is it in Kyrgyzstan? Is that where it is?
Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah. Isaac Kool. Mm-hmm. And this lake we had talked about before, they had this back in the 1930s, discovered 3 human skeletons around 10 feet tall, adorned with decorations that looked like bats made from silver. The men who found them became scared out of their wits and kept silent about their discovery for years. They did melt the silver decorations, but a small piece had been saved. Soviet scientists who had studied the piece said they could not determine its age. And there is a legend in the area that mentions a submerged lake, a submerged city in the lake. Now, that's where you have people, sort of unidentified swimmers in the lake?
Well, that was in 1982. And what happened is that the Issyk Lake itself, there is much more that had happened to it. If you go back even during our history, let's say recent history, let's say 1,000 years ago, and so forth, this is the area of the Mongols under Genghis Khan. Were quite interested in it. There are rumors that Genghis Khan was buried in it. There are also very interesting stories, not even rumors, of the Templar treasure that was buried in the lake to protect it from the Mongols. Plus, there are ancient findings in the lake itself. Now, the reason that the Issyk has been mentioned is because that officer, Soviet military officer, was in the area of Issyk, and they were basically warned by the chief of the military diver service of the engineer forces not to do a mistake that had been done in the Baikal Lake in the Soviet Union, because that's when they tried to capture those underwater swimmers, not in the Issyk Lake. This is where this is the lake that they found those skeletons before the war. Now, in the 1980s, they had another incident, and they wanted to warn, the Soviet military command wanted to warn their people in the Issyk Lake area. Apparently, they knew something, not to try to capture the so-called gigantic swimmers.
All right, now I want you to hang on to that thought, and we'll come back to that story. Sure. The gigantic swimmers. I want you to describe what they look like and how that story began to get reported and investigated. And we'll talk about that coming up next. And we'll also probably go early to the phones, but I'll tell you why coming up a little bit later on this hour. The crystal skulls is part of our discussion, the Nazis in their pursuit of them and UFOs, next with Paul Stonehill on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Enjoying our conversation with Paul Stonehill. I want to ask him about today's big news story about the dirt sample that the Phoenix Mars lander scooped but then had trouble with, bobbled, as it were. I'll ask him about that coming up in just a second. But also we'll get back to our conversation about this lake in Kyrgyzstan and how in this remote part of the country there had been reports of an underwater city in the lake, a deep lake, a deep warm lake. Issyk actually is the local language for warm lake. And then the reports that were coming out about mysterious swimmers being found in that water, being seen in that water. And the intervention from the Soviet Union, who at the time came in to warn the local officials, don't go in there looking in there. Don't go trying to find about those swimmers. And they told them the story that Paul Stonehill is going to tell you coming up in just a minute about what they found when they went swimming in another lake in the Soviet Union, going in to find similar mysterious swimmers, and how that ended coming up in just a moment. Also coming up tomorrow night, I'll be doing Coast to Coast AM, and I'm looking forward to my conversation with Jesus Christ tomorrow night. Got to be listening. You'll know what we're talking about tomorrow night on Coast to Coast AM. Also, Captain Kelly Sweeney in the first hour on piracy around the world. He's just gotten back into port. He's got some new stories to tell us about things that are happening out in the high seas. He'll share that with us, and I'll give you an update on our D.B. Cooper story. Why is it that the FBI is holding out on verifying what we were able to determine on Coast to Coast AM? This is Ian Punnett. So we're talking with Paul Stonehill. Hey, Paul Stonehill, where did you say you're originally from? Was it Russia?
Ukraine.
You're from the Ukraine.
Yeah, and I'm very glad Ukraine is an independent country.
Yeah, I imagine so. I think it's only fair that, if Richard C. Hoagland gets to be the first science officer on Coast to Coast AM, that if he gets to play Spock, you get to play Chekhov. Okay? You get to be our official Chekhov.
All right.
Show.
If I get paid, yeah.
If you get paid. Spoken like Richard C. Hoagland.
You got it.
All right, so let me throw this at you here before we get back to the discussion of that lake, because I meant to ask you about this when you were talking about the Mars lander earlier. There are two stories that have come up so far. That weird footprint, what looked like a footprint in the Martian soil, that NASA was very quick to explain could not possibly be a footprint, but rather was the sort of the foot pad of the Mars robot, and then also this story about how the soil is too clumped for the dirt to be analyzed by the Phoenix Mars lander. Where are you with those two stories?
You know what? I was very much interested when they had a picture of the ice supposedly under the soil of Mars.
Right.
It could be ice. It could be something. It could be something else. It could be an artificial structure. I don't believe most of the things that NASA says, to be honest. I don't think they can explain the story of the footprint and a skeleton that allegedly was found on the surface of the moon. But the Chinese know quite more about it than or revealed more. So I don't believe much that